Do you ever wonder which breaths of history were stolen while we slept? A parchment torn, a monk silenced, a page soaked through with winter rain. What might have been whispered there? So before you slip too far beneath the furs, take a slow breath. Tap the heart if the murmur pleases you. Press subscribe only if the hush feels right. And in the comments, leave the name of the place where night is unfolding around you, along with its quiet hour. The candle is small, the dark is patient. Somewhere in the 9th century Frankish court, quills scratched daily accounts, taxation, eclipses, compliance with Rome. Yet between the lines of 793 and 799, a pall of blankness stretches an oddly muted corridor. Officially, this was the lull before the Northern Storm, the years when the Sea Kings sharpened axes in distant fjords. But if no raids had yet come, why do we find prayers for deliverance embedded in earlier litanies? Why did bishops copy verses begging for mercy from dragon-proud demons? The scribes do not explain. They simply turn the page, leaving a cold silence where the ink should glimmer. Fragments surface elsewhere. A dented reliquary in Saint-Denis, melted and recast, its base stamped with a date preceding the first acknowledged Viking incursion. The metalworkers left a barely legible mark, an oval counterstamp identical to one from Hedeby's marketplace. How could a Danish assay mark Reachsena wine country before the chronicles speak of northern sails? Did merchants arrive in peace, or was there an earlier clash smoothed away like spilled wax? Northward, by the cliffs of Jutland, archaeologists sift an abandoned longhouse whose charred beams carry residues of foreign pitch, pine unnative to Denmark, chemically matched to forests near the Loire. In a corner, fused glass beads display cobalt traces from Mediterranean kilns. A skald might have composed verses to glorify such far-snatched plunder, yet no saga preserves those lines. Instead, later poets begin abruptly with the infamous year when Lindisfarne burned, as though the tale required a single thunderclap to announce itself. The absence before that thunder is palpable, like the intake of breath before a scream. Some historians suggest pragmatic erasure. Frankish chroniclers, intent on projecting order, may have eclipsed reports of humiliation, rewriting defeats as diplomatic exchanges or omitting them altogether. A parchment could be scraped clean. Vellum was expensive. One scraped sheet could bear a new psalm in place of an old panic. Palimpsests betray these ghosts. Under ultraviolet light, faint strokes emerge. Latin words for Northmen blurred by later hymns. Why sing louder if not to drown another melody? Others blame the rhythm of climate. The late 8th century bore witness to sudden storms, crop failures and migrations southward. Records might have perished in flooded scriptoriums, eaten by mould, consumed in hearths when firewood ran short. Yet when monasteries catalogue their losses, they list grain, cattle, even candle stubs, but not books. Was literacy valued so little, or were missing codices too delicate to mention because their dog-eared tales told of defeat? A different shiver slips through the runic poems. The Old English 9 herbs charm, copied, scholars think, around the same withheld years, invokes protection against a serpent who flies in from the north. Some linguists note a curious borrow word within the verse, one that mirrors Old Norse phonemes not attested in England until generations later. Linguistic drift would normally take decades. A lone word arriving early as a pebble thrown into still water, ripples betraying an unseen hand. Picture a twilight shore, pebbles slick with brine, where a single Nor slides in under low cloud. No horns, no flaming prow, only muffled oars. Perhaps the crew traded quietly, exchanging amber for salt, iron for smoked eels. Perhaps a priest recorded the meeting, promising a fuller account at dawn. Dawn did not cooperate. A tide rose, a gale tore parchment from his grip, or a dagger found its way between ribs, we cannot be sure. We inherit only the hush that followed, and in that hush the narrative hardened. Later kings, needing enemies bold enough to magnify royal triumphs, painted the Vikings as sudden scourges erupting without warning, a neat origin story convenient for sermons urging tithes and higher walls. A linear history comforts, it lets sleepers rest. Yet the sea is rarely linear. Tides return, but eddies swirl where currents collide. Memory too may double back, carrying wreckage from a forgotten ship toward a present sand. Listen to the surf against the mined shore. Can you hear timbers groan, anchors drag? When scholars hold a bone comb from Rebe beside one found in Reims, 1,000 kilometres apart, the carvings match as though etched by the same distracted hand. Coincidence, or the residue of a voyage left unmentioned? Each artifact is a syllable. Together they hint at sentences excised from the story we recite. So we linger within the blank margin, tracing its faint grain, wondering what ink once lay there. We breathe with the missing words, letting their shape impress upon inner eyelids. If history is a loom, these holes are the taut places where threads snapped and were retied, leaving a knot we pretend not to see. Tomorrow we might tug one strand and feel the entire tapestry quiver, yet sleep tugs first. Between the pulse of waves and the creak of unrecorded oars, let your thoughts drift, soft as sea mist sliding past a lantern. Somewhere, the next fragment waits beneath sediment or inside a palimpsest, restless and whispering. Will it align with the chronicles or fracture them further? The sand keeps its secret until morning, and our lantern is faltering. That snapped thread we left dangling in the coastal fog, does it lead inland, or does it stretch taut across the water, a guideline into a colder, brighter silence? The parchments that fell silent in Francia were filled with the business of kings and God. But the sagas sung by firelight in the long dark of the north were meant to be different. They were chronicles of sinew and salt, of memory held in the mouth. Yet even here, in the supposed heartwood of the Norse story, there are hollows, not just gaps, but places where the narrative seems to deliberately look away, toward a horizon it refuses to name. Follow the thread west, past Iceland's smoking mountains, to a land of impossible green. The Greenland settlement, a foothold on the edge of the world, thrived for 4 centuries. They built churches of stone and turf, their foundations still sharp against the tundra. They hunted walrus for ivory to trade with Bergen and Rome, their farms clinging to the brief summer. The sagas of Eric the Red and his kin speak of this journey, a proud boast of settlement. But they grow quieter about its end. The last ship known to have returned from Greenland docked in Norway in 1410. After that, nothing. A 500-year-long exhalation of breath and then stillness. When visitors finally returned in the 18th century, they found only ruins. The farms were buried under wind-scoured soil, the churches unroofed, the graves undisturbed but empty of the living. The official story blames the Little Ice Age, a slow, merciless strangulation by cold. The pastures failed, the sea lanes choked with ice, the people starved or simply faded away. A clean, tragic narrative of climate and collapse, but the earth itself whispers a different story. Core samples from the buried farmland show that the soil was exhausted, overgrazed decades before the deepest cold set in. The Norse were master farmers. Could they have been so blind to the ruin of their own land? Or were they looking elsewhere, their attention fixed on beyond the horizon? In the Vatican archives, a single letter from Pope Nicholas V, dated 1448, mentions the Greenlanders. It speaks of a raid 30 years prior by pagans from the neighbouring shores, who burned the churches and carried many away into slavery. Who were these pagans? The Inuit, whose technology was ill-suited for such organised warfare? Or someone else? The letter is vague, its source unknown. It is the only written account from the outside world that speaks of Greenland's fate in those final years. A single, trembling voice in a vast, cold silence. Why was there no crusade, no rescue mission? Was the colony simply forgotten, written off as a bad debt on the ledgers of Christendom? The deepest strangeness, however, lies not in their end, but in what they might have been seeking. The sagas mention voyages further west, to Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. They are presented as brief, almost disappointing excursions, a few skirmishes with natives, a failed attempt at settlement, and then a return. But is that all? In the 1960s, a small Norse outpost was unearthed at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland. It confirmed the sagas, but the site was small, temporary. It doesn't feel like the final chapter. It feels like a footnote. Consider the main penny, a genuine Norse coin from the reign of Olaf Kyrre, minted between 1065 and 1080. It was found at a Native American archaeological site in Maine, a place the sagas never mention. It was perforated, likely worn as a pendant. How did it travel so far south centuries before Columbus? Was it the lone token of a lost sailor, a trade that went unrecorded? Or was it a signpost to a much wider, more sustained presence, a web of contact and exchange that was never woven into the official tales? The sagas are hero stories, focused on chieftains and first discoveries. They have no time for the quiet, multi-generational work of trade, of coexistence, of slow assimilation. Such stories leave no glory, only ghosts. And then there is the ice. Locked in the Greenland ice sheet are layers of atmospheric history. Scientists drilling cores have found evidence of extensive, deliberate burning in North America, far exceeding natural forest fires dating to the centuries of the Norse presence. They were clearing land, but the settlement at Lonso Meadows is too small to account for such activity. Where were the other farms, the other longhouses? Did they push further south, into the dense forests of Markland, the land of wood, and simply never return, their stories dissolving into the soil like fallen leaves? Perhaps the end of the Greenland colony was not a collapse, but a migration, a deliberate step off the map of the known world, leaving the cold behind for a continent they chose not to name in their songs. Maybe the silence was a form of protection. To speak too loudly of a land of endless timber and mild winters might invite kings and tax collectors. It might bring fleets from Norway, eager to claim this new world for a distant crown. By keeping the story small, a half-failed adventure, they kept the prize for themselves. A secret whispered only from one generation of sea captains to the next. A map drawn not on parchment, but on the surface of the water itself. We are left with the hollow space between the last ship and the first ruins. A space filled with the groan of advancing ice. Yes, but also with other possibilities. A slow exodus. A quiet absorption into the peoples of the new land. A final, unrecorded voyage not of desperation but of intent. The sagas give us an ending of ice and failure. The soil and the silence suggest something else. They suggest a choice. So as you lie in the quiet of your own room, feel the weight of the blankets, the steady rhythm of your own breathing. Imagine a people standing on a frozen shore, looking one way, back toward a failing past, and the other way, toward a wilderness that promised everything and nothing. The story we're told is that the ice chose for them, but what if it didn't? What if the silence in the sagas is the sound of a door being gently closed on the old world, by a hand that did not wish to be followed? Sometimes a story is not erased, but misplaced. It does not vanish into ice or fade from a page. It simply falls, silent and unnoticed, into the soft earth of a forest floor, 1,000 miles from where it ought to be. It waits for a shift in the wind, a turning of the soil. So as the world outside your window settles into its own deep quiet, feel free to close your eyes. If these whispers find you, a simple tap on the screen is enough, and I wonder what hour of the night has claimed your town. Let me know below. The cold of the Greenland void recedes, and in its place rises the scent of pine and damp earth. We leave the edge of the known world for its heart, the dense, winding riverlands that feed the Baltic Sea. Here, the story was meant to be one of amber. That fossilized sunlight traded along the coasts, passed from hand to hand in a predictable, well-documented rhythm. Yet, when archaeologists brush the dirt from a cache of amber beads near the mouth of the Vistula, they find them nestled against something else. Glass. Not the crude, bubbly glass of local kilns, but the deep, clear cobalt of Byzantine workshops, the swirling patterns of Sasanian Persia. The carbon dating of the surrounding peat places the deposit a full generation before the Varangian Rus are said to have carved their first trade routes down the Dnieper to Constantinople. How did these delicate fragments of a southern empire arrive so early? The accepted maps show no direct path. The rivers were treacherous, the forests filled with hostile tribes. History insists the way was not yet open. But the beads are there, cool and smooth against the historian's palm, irrefutable. They whisper of a different map, a secret artery pumping goods and stories through the continent's dark interior long before the first official pulse was recorded. Was there a forgotten path, a temporary truce, a lone wanderer who carried a pouch of glass through a wilderness that should have swallowed him whole? The chronicles do not say. They are busy charting the grand voyages, the sea lanes. They have no time for a handful of beads that defy their logic. The anomaly deepens further inland. Follow the rivers away from the sea, into the great forests of what would one day become Poland. Here, far from any known Norse settlement or waterway navigable by a longship, a farmer's plough in the 20th century struck something hard. Not a stone, but iron. It was a smith's hammer, its shape distinctly Scandinavian, the peen worn from shaping blades, the haft long since turned to dust. Metallurgical analysis traced the iron ore to a specific mine in central Sweden. It is a tool of creation, a symbol of Thor, an object that belongs in a bustling workshop in Birka or Hedeby, surrounded by the clang of anvils and the smell of coal smoke. Instead, it was found alone, buried in silent loam, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly shore. What journey did this hammer take? A smith would not have abandoned it lightly. It was his livelihood, his identity. It was not the sort of thing left behind in a hasty trade. Its weight speaks of purpose. Did its owner travel on foot, a solitary missionary of a craft, or a refugee from a forgotten conflict? Or was he a captive, marched inland, who dropped his hammer in a last act of defiance or despair? The soil around the hammer bears no other trace. No bones, no coins, no pottery. Just the tool, waiting. Its isolation is a statement, a question posed in rust and iron. It suggests a human presence where none was thought to exist, a thread of movement completely contrary to the grand coastal narrative of Viking expansion. Perhaps the story we've been told, the one of sails and shores, is only the outer layer. Perhaps the true expansion was quieter, more intimate, moving not in fleets but in footsteps. Think of the tales that are never recorded. The deserter who walks east instead of west. The trader who leaves the river to follow a rumour of untapped riches. The shaman who seeks a sacred grove deep in a foreign wood. These individual journeys would leave no epic poems, no rune stones. They would leave only the smallest of traces, a glass bead, a lost tool, like breadcrumbs dropped in an immense forest, hinting at a path no one can follow. This challenges the very image of the Viking, not just a raider, a seaman, but perhaps also a wanderer of the deep woods, as comfortable with the rustle of leaves as with the crash of waves. These sagas, obsessed with lineage and honour won in battle, would have no words for such a person. He would be an outcast, a ghost in his own history. The hammer's silence is profound because it represents all the unwritten lives, the ventures that were too small, too strange, or too unsuccessful to be woven into the grand tapestry. So we hold this object in our mind's eye, the smooth, worn metal, the faint scent of ancient forge fire and cold earth. It is a key without a lock, a sentence without a page. It insists on a version of the past that is more complex, more tangled than the one we are comfortable with. It suggests that for every fleet that sailed the open sea, there may have been a lone figure moving through the trees, his motives as obscure as the forest canopy above him. As your own breathing deepens, let the image of the hammer settle. Feel its dense, quiet weight. It is an anchor, not for a ship, but for a possibility. A possibility that history is not just a collection of recorded events, but also an ocean of unrecorded silences, and that sometimes the most profound truths are not found in the clamour of a king's court, but in the hush of a single, misplaced object. What other secrets lie sleeping just beneath the surface, waiting for the gentle pressure of a curious hand? The earth holds them close, its patience far deeper than our own. A misplaced tool whispers of a life unrecorded, a journey taken in silence. But what happens when the silence is not an absence, but a deliberate construction? What if the message is not lost, but carved in granite for all to see, yet it speaks in riddles, or tells a lie so bold it becomes truth? We move from the soft earth that hides things to the hard stone that displays them, and we ask, does permanence guarantee clarity? As your own world darkens and the noises of the day recede, allow this question to settle. If this quiet exploration resonates, you know what to do. And tell me, in your corner of the globe, what time is it now? In the Swedish province of Östergötland stands a pillar of grey granite, nearly 4 meters tall, covered on 5 sides with the longest runic inscription known. This is the Rök stone, a monument from the early 9th century. For over 100 years, the accepted story has been a simple, human one. A chieftain named Varn carved it in memory of his dead son, Vemod. The runes, we were told, speak of heroic kings and mythic battles, a father's grief woven into the fabric of epic lore. It is a tidy explanation. It fits the narrative of a proud warrior culture obsessed with honour and lineage. It is a story that feels solid as the stone itself. But if you stand before it in the low light of a northern winter, another feeling emerges. The runes are tight, cramped, almost secretive. They employ complex codes, kennings, and cryptographic tricks. It does not feel like a public proclamation of grief. It feels like a desperate whisper, intended only for those who already hold the key. In recent years, a new reading has emerged, one that unhooks the stone from its simple, heroic anchor. A team of scholars, looking not at sagas but at climatology and comparative mythology, proposed a different translation. They suggest the inscription is not about a lost son but a lost son. They argue the riddles speak of a cosmic catastrophe, a memory of the devastating volcanic winter of 536 AD, when an atmospheric dust veil plunged much of the world into darkness and cold, causing famine and collapse. The stone, in their reading, becomes a complex charm, an invocation to prevent the return of Fimbulwinter, the great winter of prophecy that precedes Ragnarök. It is a monument not to a personal loss, but to a collective trauma, an existential terror that the light might fail again. The hero is not a king on a battlefield, but the sun itself. Suddenly, the fierce Viking chieftain is transformed into a fearful man, staring at the sky, using the magic of runes to hold back a darkness his ancestors had warned him about. The stone is not a memorial, but a warning. Which story is true? The granite is silent on the matter. It allows both interpretations to exist, its carved serpent guarding the riddle. Travel south, across the water to Denmark, to the town of Jelling. Here stand two more runestones, the monuments of kings. The smaller one was raised by King Gorm the Old for his wife. The larger one, a magnificent three-sided stone, was erected by their son Harald Bluetooth. Its message is not cryptic, it is perfectly clear, a blast of political propaganda. Harald, the inscription boasts, is the one who won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. It is called Denmark's birth certificate. Here, history seems to begin, written in bold, declarative strokes. Yet this too may be a kind of lie. Not a riddle, but an oversimplification so extreme it becomes a falsehood. The historical and archaeological records tell a messier story. Harald's control over all of Denmark was tenuous, constantly contested by local chieftains. His claim over Norway was even more fragile, a brief period of influence, not absolute rule. And the conversion of the Danes was not a singular event accomplished by one king's decree. It was a slow, syncretic process stretching over generations, with old gods and the new Christ coexisting uneasily for centuries. The Jelling stone is not a record of what was, it is a statement of what Harald wanted to be. It is an attempt to erase the complexity, the dissent, the lingering paganism, and replace it with a clean, singular narrative of a unified, Christian kingdom under one powerful ruler. It uses the permanence of stone to create a political reality, to carve over the inconvenient truths. Here are two monuments, two of the most important documents of their age, both meant to speak forever. One may be hiding a deep cultural fear behind the mask of a heroic lament. The other is hiding political fragility behind a mask of absolute power. The Rook stone obscures its message with riddles. The Jelling stone obscures the truth with clarity. Both manipulate the story. They remind us that history is not just what happened, but what people chose to record and how they chose to frame it. The carver's chisel can be as much an instrument of erasure as a book burner's fire. So as you lie in the quiet, feel the weight of these stones. Imagine tracing the deep grooves of a rune with your finger. The stone is cold, unyielding. It feels ancient, truthful. But what is it telling you? Is it the story the carver intended? Or is it a story he was trying to hide? The coiled serpents and beasts that writhe around the inscriptions on these stones suddenly seem less like decoration and more like guardians, protecting the words, yes, but also trapping them, holding their secrets in a grip of stone. If even these public, permanent declarations are so profoundly unstable, what can we trust? What happens when we turn from the monument to the eyewitness, from the granite to the fleeting human memory of an event? Does the story become any clearer, or does it simply fracture into even more pieces? The stone, for all its permanence, offers only riddles and proclamations, its cold surface deflecting our deepest questions. So we turn from it, leaving the granite guardians to their secrets, and seek the story in something more fragile, more alive, a human voice, a memory written in trembling ink. We seek the eyewitness. We travel to the place where the story we all know is said to have begun, on the holy island of Lindisfarne in the year 793. The air is salt sharp. The cry of gulls is the only sound. It is a scene of perfect monastic peace, waiting to be shattered. But was the silence ever that pure? As the day's last light fades from your own sky, let your mind drift to that windswept coast. If this journey holds you, let me know with a simple gesture. And I'm curious, what is the quiet hour where you are? This is the foundational scene of the Viking Age, its brutal baptism. On the 8th of June, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us, the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island by rapine and slaughter. Alcuin of York, writing from Charlemagne's court, lamented in a letter, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets." The imagery is stark, apocalyptic. Fiery dragons were seen in the sky, a whirlwind of lightning and fire, a great famine followed. The narrative is not just a report, it is a theological sermon. This was not a mere raid. It was a divine punishment for the sins of the Northumbrians. This is the story that has echoed down through the centuries, the single violent clap of thunder that announced the storm. It is clean, terrible, and unambiguous. But human memory, even when written down, is never so simple. Alcuin was hundreds of miles away, hearing the news weeks, perhaps months later, filtered through the shock and grief of refugees. The scribes of the Chronicle were writing their entry years after the event, shaping it to fit a broader narrative of suffering and redemption. These are not eyewitness accounts. They are echoes shaped by fear, faith, and the political need to explain a catastrophe. They tell us how the event was felt, but not necessarily how it was. And what if the physical evidence, the memory held by the earth itself, tells a different story? When archaeologists dig into the soil of Lindisfarne, they are searching for the black layer of ash and destruction that should mark the year 793, and they find it. But beneath it, in older strata, they find other things, other layers of soot, evidence of other earlier fires. The serene, untouched sanctuary of Alcuin's letters begins to waver. The island had a history before that fateful June day, a history that was not entirely peaceful. Was the Great Raid of 793 the first violation, or was it merely the most memorable, the one that finally broke the silence? The story fractures further when we consider the sea. Lindisfarne was not an isolated outpost of prayer. It was a nexus of power, wealth, and trade. Its scriptorium produced magnificent gospels. Its coffers held donations from kings. It sat directly on the great maritime highway of the North Sea. To imagine that its monks had never seen a Scandinavian sail before 793 is to imagine a watchman on a busy road who has never seen a traveller. Is it not more likely that Northmen had come before? Not as raiders, but as traders. Men who came to exchange furs and walrus ivory for wine, wheat, and English wool. Imagine a different scene. Not a sudden terror, but a familiar one. A longship beaches on the sand and the monks recognise the crew. They have traded with them before. But this time, something is different. The smiles are gone. A price is disputed. An insult is perceived. A weapon is drawn. Or perhaps the motive was simpler still. The visitors knew exactly how wealthy the monastery was, not from rumour, but from first-hand observation. The raid was not a blind act of pagan fury, but a calculated strike based on insider knowledge. The line between a trader and a raider can be as thin as the edge of an axe. This possibility changes everything. It replaces the myth of monstrous demons erupting from the sea with a more complex and perhaps more disturbing human story of relationships soured, of trust betrayed. It suggests the Vikings were not an alien force, but a known quantity, a part of the intricate political and economic web of the North Sea world who simply decided one day to pull a different thread. The chronicles have no room for such a messy, morally ambiguous tale. A story of divine punishment requires clear villains and clear victims. The grey shades of prior contact, of a familiarity that curdled into violence, would only confuse the sermon. And so, it may have been omitted, smoothed over, forgotten. As you rest in the deepening quiet, let the single, clear image of the burning church at Lindisfarne dissolve. Let it be replaced by a series of more fleeting pictures, a monk and a northern merchant haggling over the price of a silver brooch, a shared meal of bread and dried fish on the beach, a tense moment of misunderstanding, a hand moving slowly toward a hilt. The past is not a single, solid event. It is a cloud of possibilities, and the story we are told is often just the one that casts the sharpest, simplest shadow. What other relationships, what other moments of contact and conflict were erased to make that shadow appear so stark? The ashes of Lindisfarne hide more than just the bones of saints. They hide the ashes of other, earlier fires, the quiet memories of a time before the world decided it had to be afraid. The memory of fire is sharp and absolute, a story told in ash and absence. But water tells a different kind of tale. It does not erase, it preserves. It cradles secrets in silt, holding them in a cold, quiet embrace until they are ready to surface. We drift from the burnt shores of Lindisfarne, letting the tide carry us back toward the heart of the Danish kingdom, to the great fjord that leads to Roskilde. Here, the story is not of a sanctuary violated, but of one defended. Yet even in defence, in the deliberate act of sinking ships to protect a capital, other unintended truths are submerged. As the rhythm of your own breathing slows, like the gentle pull of a deep current, let your thoughts sink into that dark water. If this descent into the quiet past brings you a sense of peace, a simple touch is all that is needed. And in your part of the world, has the moon risen yet? In the 20th century, during the dredging of Roskilde fjord, the remains of 5 Viking ships were discovered, deliberately scuttled around the year 1070 to create a blockade, a naval barrier to protect the city from attack. They were raised, preserved, and celebrated. Skulderlev II, the great longship, Skulderlev III, the sturdy cargo vessel. They became icons, tangible proof of the skill and power of the Danish sea kings. The story was straightforward: a kingdom protecting its heart, a strategic sacrifice of valuable assets. It is a narrative of strength, of control. But the wood, once it began to speak under the patient analysis of scientists, told a more complicated story. Dendrochronology, the science of reading the history in a tree's rings, revealed that the great longship, the pride of the fleet, was not built in Denmark at all. Its oaks were felled near Dublin, in Ireland, around the year 1042. Suddenly, the ship is not just a vessel, it is a political statement, a piece of a forgotten alliance or a captured prize from a battle no saga remembers. The official royal ledgers of the time are silent on the origin of the fleet. They list ships by their Danish commanders, implying local construction. Why omit the Irish connection? Was it a point of pride, a refusal to admit that the kingdom's defence relied on foreign craftsmanship? Or was it a secret, a covert alliance with an Irish king that had to be kept from the ears of rivals in Norway or England? The ship, meant to be a simple shield, becomes a ghost of a lost political landscape. The smaller cargo ship whispers a different secret. Its timbers are local, Danish oak, but its repairs tell of long journeys, patches made of pine from the deep forests of western Norway, planks of Baltic oak from the southern coast of the sea. These repairs are like scars, each one a record of a storm weathered, a distant port visited. Yet the trade logs and royal accounts of Roskilde from that era do not mention voyages to these specific regions. They chart the main, profitable routes to England and Frisia. These scars speak of other travels, perhaps unsanctioned, private ventures that a merchant undertook at his own risk. Or perhaps they were missions of a more clandestine nature, carrying spies or illicit goods along paths the king didn't want officially mapped. The ship's own body has become a ledger that contradicts the crown's. And then there is the mud, the soft dark silt that filled the hulls for 900 years. When analysed, this sediment gives up its own ghosts, pollen. Not just the expected grains of local barley and rye, but the unmistakable pollen of maize, a plant of the Americas, a crop that should not exist in Europe for another 400 years. The finding is so anomalous, so impossible, that it is usually dismissed as contamination from modern times, but the pollen is found deep within the sealed layers of silt, alongside Norse artefacts. It is a whisper so faint, so contrary to everything we know, that it is easier not to hear it. But it is there. Does it hint at a journey even further than the sagas of Vinland suggest? A journey whose survivors brought back not a heroic tale, but a handful of strange seeds, a curiosity that was planted, flowered once, and was then forgotten, leaving only this microscopic trace in the mud of a sunken ship. The official story of Roskilde is one of a kingdom looking inward, defending itself. The physical evidence, however, speaks of a world that was vastly more interconnected and far-reaching than the records admit. It speaks of Irish shipwrights, Norwegian timber, and the phantom pollen of a new world. The act of sinking those ships was meant to close a channel, to create a barrier, but in doing so, it inadvertently opened another, a rift in the official narrative. It preserved the evidence of all the journeys, alliances and contacts that were too inconvenient, too secret, or perhaps too unbelievable to be written down. As you drift now on the edge of sleep, imagine that dark, silent water. Imagine the slow, patient settling of silt over wood. The water does not judge. It does not edit. It simply holds. It holds the king's shield, but it also holds the secret repairs, the foreign wood, the impossible pollen. It reminds us that what is deliberately hidden is often preserved right alongside what is proudly displayed. The truth of the past is not a single narrative, but a layered thing, like the sediment on a fjord floor. And sometimes you have to look within the wreck itself to find the map of the voyage. What other maps lie sleeping in the silt, waiting for the patient eye that is willing to see what should not be there? The water gives up its ghosts, but only in whispers. Pollen, wood grain, the silt of forgotten voyages. It holds a map of what was, but not of how it came to be. To find that, we must leave the seabed and look up, to the oldest map of all, the cold, indifferent star field of the North Atlantic. It was by this map that the Norse found their way to the edge of the world. But what happens when the map itself becomes unreadable? As the last echoes of your day fade and your own room becomes a quiet harbour, let us sail into that darkness. If this journey through the night continues to hold you, a tap of the screen is all the signal needed. I wonder, has your part of the world fallen into the deep hours yet? The Vinland sagas are not just stories. They are charts drawn in words. They speak of sailing west from the Herjolfsnes settlement in Greenland, of keeping the ice fields to port, of 2 days' sail to a land of flat stones they called Helluland, another 2 to a forested shore they named Markland, and then south to a place of wild grapes and warm rivers, Vinland. It sounds so simple, so direct. A set of directions passed from one captain to another. For a century, Historians and archaeologists have followed these verbal maps, trying to place them onto the coastlines of Newfoundland and Labrador, searching for the nail, the spindle whorl, the longhouse foundation that will make the story lock into place. But the map is a phantom. The two surviving sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, disagree on who deserves the credit, on the sequence of events, on the very nature of the first encounters with the native people they called Skraelings. They read less like historical records and more like competing claims in a family inheritance dispute, each one subtly reshaping the journey to favour its own hero. The horizon line of the story is crooked, warped by pride and the passage of time. The directions are clear enough to prove they went somewhere, but vague enough to ensure we can never be certain where. It is a map that leads only to a mist of possibility. And how did they follow even this hazy map across one of the most treacherous oceans on Earth? The magnetic compass was not yet in their world. We are told they used the sun, and indeed the legendary solar steen, or sunstone, a piece of calcite or cordierite that can polarize light, would have allowed a skilled navigator to find the sun's position even through thick cloud. A simple wooden disc with a central gnomon, an artifact like the one found at Unatok in Greenland, could have served as a sun compass, allowing them to hold a steady latitude. These were the tools for the day. But the Atlantic is a realm of fog and long nights. In the darkness they had only the stars. Polaris, the North Star, was their one fixed point, the nail upon which the whole sky seemed to turn. And we must imagine them possessing a knowledge we have lost, a deep, intuitive literacy of the night sky, perhaps aided by tools that did not survive, tables of stellar positions scratched onto whalebone, diagrams of coastal silhouettes meant to be matched against the rising or setting of certain constellations. A walrus tusk found at an Icelandic farmstead, etched with a complex series of geometric patterns, has been interpreted by some as just such a device, a portable calculator for turning the movement of the heavens into a steady course. This is the image we hold, a people of incredible skill and courage, navigating by sun glint and starlight, their knowledge a fragile thread stretched across a vast dark emptiness. But what if the thread snapped? What if the sky itself, their most reliable guide, betrayed them? Astronomers and geologists know that the sun is not a stable engine. It has fits of violent rage. A massive solar storm, a coronal mass ejection on the scale of the 1859 Carrington event, would have unleashed a tempest of charged particles upon the Earth. The immediate effect in the northern latitudes would have been an aurora of unimaginable scale and intensity. Not the gentle, shimmering curtain of green light we know, but a sky alive, from horizon to horizon, with blood-red, violet, and searing white fire. A terrifying, beautiful apocalypse. For a navigator in the mid-Atlantic, this celestial storm would have been utterly disorienting. The familiar constellations, the anchor points of his mental map, would have been washed out, drowned in a sea of chaotic light. Polaris would vanish. The star paths he used to measure his progress would be gone. He would be blind. If he possessed a piece of lodestone, a primitive magnetic compass kept as a secret treasure, the geomagnetic storm would have sent its needle spinning uselessly. The map would not just be unreadable, it would be actively lying. The very forces that guided him would have turned into agents of chaos. No saga speaks of such an event, but why would it? A ship that was lost in this way would leave no survivors to tell the tale. It would simply sail on into oblivion, its crew convinced they were on the right course, while the cosmos silently pushed them into the empty southern waters or back into the northern ice. Entire expeditions mentioned in one chronicle simply vanish from the next. We blame storms, ice, human error. But perhaps the cause was more profound. Perhaps a generation of the most skilled navigators was wiped out, their secret knowledge of the sky map lost with them, because the sky itself broke. All that would be left is a void in the record, a story that begins, points west, and then simply stops. So as you settle into the quiet of your own night, imagine that lone ship. The navigator stands at the steering oar, his face lit not by the moon, but by a terrifying divine fire that has consumed the heavens. Every instinct, every piece of ancestral knowledge is now worthless. He is adrift on an ocean beneath a sky he no longer recognizes. The silence from that ship is absolute. It is the silence of a map being burned, not by human hands, but by the sun itself. And it leaves the deepest question of all. What other voyages ended not in failure, but in a mystery so complete that it left not even a ripple in the stories we tell? A sky without stars offers no map, only a terrifying silent chaos. A voyage that ends in such a void leaves no story, only an unanswered question that fades into the cold sea mist. But sometimes the map is not written in the heavens, but woven in threads of silk. It is not a guide for a journey, but the final destination itself, folded carefully and laid to rest in the dark earth of a Swedish grave. We turn our gaze from the vast emptiness of the ocean to the intimate darkness of a single burial chamber. As the world outside stills and your own breath finds a slower rhythm, let us sift through that silent earth together. If this exploration of hidden threads speaks to you, a quiet tap on the screen is enough, and tell me, what hour of the night has found you? At the trading town of Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren, the soil is rich with the ghosts of the Viking age. Hundreds of graves dot the landscape, each a small contained universe of belief and identity. Archaeologists have opened these chambers to find the expected emblems of a Norse life. Swords for the warrior, scales for the merchant, amulets of Thor's hammer for protection in the afterlife. The story these graves tell seems consistent with the one we know, but in the mid-20th century, and again more recently, within the quiet of these burials, excavators found something that did not belong: threads. Not the coarse wool of a local loom, but the impossibly fine filament of silk. The silk itself was a sign of wealth and far-reaching contact, a luxury good that travelled the great river routes from the south. But this was more than just a status symbol. When the fragile earth-stained fragments were examined, they revealed patterns, and within the patterns, woven in shimmering silver and gold thread, were characters. Not runes, but the elegant angular lines of Kufic Arabic script. In one grave, a woman's, these woven bands were found on her burial clothes, and the words they spelled out were Allah and Ali, the central name of God in Islam, and the name of his revered son-in-law resting for 1,000 years in the pagan earth of the north, beside the body of a woman who likely wore a Mjolnir amulet around her neck. The presence of these threads sends a tremor through the foundations of the familiar narrative. The tidy story is that the Vikings saw the Islamic world as a source of silver dirhams, to be plundered or traded for, then melted down, their foreign markings and religious significance erased. The sagas speak of encounters in the East, but they are tales of violence and commerce, not of cultural or spiritual exchange. Yet here is the name of Allah, not on a coin to be weighed and spent, but woven into a garment to be worn, perhaps cherished, and ultimately taken to the grave. How do we read this map of threads? The simplest explanation is that the silk was acquired as loot or trade, its meaning entirely lost on its new owner. To the woman in the grave, the Kufic script may have been nothing more than an exotic, beautiful pattern, its spiritual power inert, its message silent. She wore it as a sign of her connection to a world of distant riches, not a world of foreign faith. This is the comfortable answer. It keeps the worlds separate, the identities pure. The Viking remains a Viking, simply adorned with the spoils of a remote and misunderstood culture. But the threads pull at this simple conclusion. The silk bands were not randomly attached. They were integral parts of the costume, placed deliberately. The act of weaving a sacred name into cloth is a conscious one. The act of wearing it is also a choice. Did no one along the vast trade route, from the workshops of the Caliphate, through the hands of Bulgar and Ross merchants to the markets of Birka, explain what these words meant? Is it possible that the Vikings, a people obsessed with the power of symbols, of runes, of the names of their own gods, would be entirely incurious about the potent signs emblazoned on their most precious textiles? Or must we consider a more unsettling possibility, that the meaning was not lost, that it was perhaps understood, at least in part? We know there were Norsemen who served as mercenaries in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, who travelled the Volga to the Caspian Sea. They encountered the Islamic world not just as a remote source of silver, but as a living, breathing civilization. Could some of them have brought back more than just coins and silk? Could they have brought back ideas, stories, a sense of a different kind of power, a different name for the divine? Perhaps the woman in the grave was not a convert, but someone living in a world where symbols were more fluid, where the name of a powerful god from a powerful empire could be worn as a form of protection, an extra layer of magic alongside the hammer of Thor, not a replacement but an addition. This is a history that has no place in the official accounts. It is a story of nuance, of blurred edges, of a quiet personal syncretism that would have been incomprehensible to the Christian chroniclers who wrote so much of what we know. The threads are so fragile. When exposed to the air after a millennium, some of them turn to dust. The act of finding the evidence can destroy it. Perhaps our own history is just as fragile, a narrative woven from the few, coarse threads that survived, while the finer, more complex and more contradictory silks have simply dissolved, leaving us with a story that is simpler, stronger, but far from the whole truth. As you lie in the quiet, imagine that single, shimmering thread being pulled from the dark earth. It connects a weaver in Baghdad to a woman in Birka. It is a physical link across a continent, but it is also a link across a conceptual chasm we have built in our own minds. It asks us to consider that the past was not a world of solid, separate blocks of culture, but a vast interconnected web, and we are only now beginning to see the glint of its most delicate and most revealing strands. What other messages are waiting in the earth, written in a language we have forgotten how to read, their meaning as fragile as a spider's web at dawn? A single thread of silk pulled from the earth can unravel a comfortable story, revealing a world far more connected than we imagined. But a thread is a fragile thing. What happens when the evidence is not silk, but bone? When it is not woven into a garment, but mixed in the very ashes of a people? We leave the quiet graves of Birka and follow the long rivers east, to the great earthen mounds that rise from the Ukrainian steppe, to the place where a city of gold and smoke was born, Kyiv. The journey is long, the night is deep. As you feel the pull of sleep, let your mind drift down these ancient waterways. If these whispers in the dark resonate with you, a simple gesture is all that's needed. And tell me, what is the hour that holds your city in its spell? The story of the Kievan Rus, as it is traditionally told, is a story of conquest and assimilation. It begins with the arrival of Scandinavian adventurers, the Varangians, the Rus, who, according to the Russian primary chronicle, were invited to rule over the fractious Slavic tribes. They established a dynasty. carved out a kingdom, and in time they became Slavic. Their Norse names softened, their gods were replaced by the Orthodox Christ, their language dissolved into the local tongue. It is a neat linear story of a foreign elite being absorbed, a river of Norse culture flowing into the great sea of the Slavic people and disappearing. The burial mounds, the great kurgans that dot the landscape, were long seen as monuments to this process, the graves of Norse lords who were slowly, generation by generation, becoming Slavic princes. But when we no longer just look at the graves but listen to the bones themselves, the story begins to fray. Modern genetic analysis of the remains from these elite burials does not show a simple, one-way flow. It reveals a complex mosaic. In a single grave, you might find a man with strong Scandinavian Y-chromosomal DNA, buried with a classic Viking sword, lying next to a woman whose mitochondrial DNA traces back to local Finno-Ugric or Slavic lineages. Their children, buried nearby, carry a mixture of both. This is not a story of one group replacing or being absorbed by another. It is a story of immediate and profound fusion. From the very beginning, the Rus were not purely Norse, nor purely Slav. They were a new thing, born of the encounter, a hybrid identity forged in the bedchamber as much as on the battlefield. The artifacts buried with them tell the same tale of blurred lines. A warrior is laid to rest with an axe head forged in a Swedish style, but the wooden haft is carved with patterns from the steppes. A woman wears beads of Baltic amber, alongside pendants of a distinctly Slavic crescent moon design. And then there are the coins. Hoards of silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate and Byzantine numisma are found in abundance. But they are often not intact. They have been cut, sliced into halves and quarters to be used as bullion, their political and religious authority literally broken down into raw wealth. Some are pierced to be worn as amulets. A coin bearing the image of a Byzantine emperor might be strung on a necklace, next to a wolf's tooth and a silver Thor's hammer. The symbols of the world's great empires and religions are not being adopted wholesale. They are being disassembled and recontextualized, absorbed into a local belief system that saw power in all its forms as something to be harnessed. This physical evidence of a deeply mixed, syncretic culture sits uneasily with the written chronicles, which were composed centuries later by Christian monks. These scribes had their own agenda. They were trying to create a respectable origin story for a powerful Christian kingdom. A neat tale of Scandinavian princes bringing order to the Slavic wilderness, and then wisely accepting the one true faith from Byzantium, served this purpose perfectly. A messier, more ambiguous story of a hybrid pagan culture, where Norse and Slav were indistinguishable, where Islamic silver and Christian gold were treated as just more forms of pagan magic, did not. And so, we must ask, what was erased? The chronicles speak of treaties and battles, but they are silent on the long periods of peace, on the daily interactions, the intermarriages, the shared rituals that must have occurred. Is it possible that there were truces and alliances that have been deliberately written out of the story? Whispers exist in the margins of later sagas of a great truce sworn on the Dnieper, a pact not of conquest, but of partnership, sealed by a generation of mixed marriages. No official Slavic or Norse poem records this. Was such a memory of equal partnership too inconvenient for later kings who wanted to emphasize a clear line of dynastic, God-given authority? Did the Christian scribes need to paint the pre-Christian past as a time of chaos and conflict in order to make the arrival of their faith seem like a more profound salvation? As you lie on the edge of sleep, imagine those ashes. Imagine the dust of bone from a Swedish father and a Slavic mother mingling in the earth of a single grave. Their story is not one of conquest or submission. It is a quiet, human story of fusion. It is a story that was too complex, too nuanced, for the grand, simple narratives that later powers required. So it was buried. The bones remained, the mixed artifacts remained, but a simpler story was laid over them, like a clean new shroud. But the bones remember. The ashes hold the truth of a past where identities were not fixed but fluid, and where the most powerful kingdom of the East was born not from a victory, but from a joining. What other foundational stories of our own nations and our own identities are built upon such carefully edited ashes? The ashes of Kiev tell a story of fusion, of a beginning that was deliberately simplified, its messy hybrid truth smoothed over for the sake of a cleaner legacy. But there is another kind of silence, one that is not a revision, but a rupture. It is the silence of a story that does not end, but simply stops, a voice that is not lowered to a whisper, but is cut off mid-syllable. We travel now to the last outpost, the island of Sergus and Ice, to the place where the record of the Norse world was kept most faithfully. And it is here, in this library of fire and frost, that we find the most unsettling blank page of all. As the final, deepest quiet of the night envelops you, let your mind become that vellum page, waiting for a story that never arrives. If this last step on our journey has brought you some measure of peace, you know what gesture to make. And now, for the last time, I ask, what is the final hour you will share with me from your corner of the world? In the scriptoriums of medieval Iceland, the story of the Norse people found its most eloquent voice. Monks and scholars, surrounded by a landscape of volcanoes and glaciers, wrote with a feverish need to preserve the past. They compiled the great sagas, the Eddas, the detailed genealogies of the Landnámabók. Theirs was a culture obsessed with memory, with the unbroken chain of lineage and lore stretching back to the first settlers, back to the gods themselves. The ink on these sheepskin pages was a bulwark against the great forgetting, against the encroaching silence of a world where the old ways were dying, and yet, in the heart of this meticulous record-keeping, the story falters. Around the year 1300, a series of entries in the Icelandic annals become sparse, erratic. Then one chronicle, the Skalholtsbók, stops mid-sentence. The scribe is describing a local event, his quill forming the familiar letters, and then nothing. The rest of the page is blank. The silence that follows is not the peaceful space between chapters, it is a void. For decades afterwards, the great narrative tradition of Iceland seems to wither. The sagas of heroes give way to dry, laconic lists of bishops and livestock. The vibrant, chaotic, and deeply human voice of the Viking age seems to catch in its throat. The conventional explanation is a practical one. The climate was changing. The Little Ice Age was tightening its grip. Pastures failed, harbours froze, the vital connection to Norway frayed. Famine and disease, the Black Death stalked the island. A people struggling for survival, it's argued, have little time for telling stories. The ink froze in the inkwell. The hand that held the quill was needed to thresh the last meagre harvest. The silence is the sound of a culture turning inward, conserving its energy, its voice worn thin by hardship. It is a sad, slow, natural decline. But there is another shadow in this story, a shadow that falls not from the clouds, but from the halls of power. This period of decline coincides with the island's final complete submission to the Norwegian crown, and with it the strengthening grip of the church. A new order was being imposed, an order that valued uniformity, canon law, and a single, authorized version of history. The old stories, with their pagan kings, their blood feuds, their morally ambiguous heroes and meddling gods, were a messy, dangerous inheritance. They celebrated a world of decentralized power, of individual honor, of a time before kings and bishops held absolute sway. Could the silence have been encouraged, not with a dramatic burning of books, but with a quieter, more insidious pressure, a suggestion that certain stories were no longer useful, a shift in patronage from the skald who sang of Viking glory to the scribe who copied the lives of the saints, an edict, now lost, perhaps never even written down, but understood in the cold halls of the powerful. The past is a dangerous country. It is better to leave it unvisited. The pen that stopped mid-sentence, did the writer die? Or did he simply put it down, looking over his shoulder at a world that no longer had room for the tale he was telling? The blank page becomes not just an absence but an act of redaction. A door quietly closed and locked from the other side, and so our journey ends here, in this icy library, before a story that refuses to complete itself. We began with a silence in the Frankish annals, a hint of a story that was never told. We've travelled through a landscape of ghosts, of vanished settlements, misplaced tools, cryptic stones, forgotten fires, and sunken ships. We've seen how history is a story that is constantly being written and rewritten, not just by victors, but by the climate, by the sea, by the earth itself. And we have seen how the most powerful truths can be hidden not in a complex riddle, but in a simple, declarative lie, or in the fragile weave of a silken thread. Each silence we have touched has been different. The silence of erasure, of confusion, of fear, of fusion. But this last silence feels the most profound. It is the silence of exhaustion, the silence of a story that has finally run out of words. The Viking, the great traveller, the voice that echoed from the Caspian Sea to the shores of North America, has fallen quiet. He has returned to the mist, leaving us with only the partial, contradictory and achingly beautiful fragments of his journey. Do not try to solve the riddle of that final empty page. Let it remain a space for your own thoughts to drift into. As sleep finally claims you, let it be a quiet sea, carrying you away from these shores of doubt. The questions will still be here in the morning, waiting patiently in the stones, the ashes and the ice. They are not meant to be answered, only to be held. They are the echoes that prove the voice was once there,